Hey, Tim.
What's up, Tim?
We just watched the movie Them about ants that become radioactive after being exposed to a nuclear test and grow into gigantic monsters that will eat all humans and plant life on Earth. I think it's safe to say at this point, these atomic ants have become weapons of grass destruction.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
That's fair. Welcome to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear security for a living, and is often irritated about what he sees on film. I am not joined today by my usual podcast co-host Gabe, because he is busy wandering around the desert in a catatonic state because I told him that really bad pun about atomic ants. But for the record, I thought calling them weapons of grass destruction was pretty funny. Fortunately, I am joined over Skype today by returning guest and podcast listener favorite, Tim Collins, PhD candidate studying nuclear history of Britain at King's College London. Tim, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it's really good to be back talking about this, not least because it's a 90-minute film rather than making you watch 2 seasons of nuclear-related nonsense.
Yeah, people will probably remember Tim from our episodes on The Man in the High Castle, as well as our very popular episode on the movie Threads, also known to the people who listen as the really long episodes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Irish. We talk a lot. I'm sorry.
It's all right. This is what happens. These are the kind of conversations we would have over a beer, so we might as well record it, right?
Exactly.
So we're here today to talk about the 1954. This might be the earliest film I think we've done on the podcast yet, called Them. And just want to make, for clarification, that's Them with an exclamation mark. So if it sounds like we're yelling, we're not. We're just saying the movie title. It's one of the first giant bug monster movies that started a whole bunch of radioactive monster films in the 50s and the 60s when people really didn't know what radiation could do to you or to the environment. So they just assumed that giant monsters would be a real byproduct of nukes, or at least make for an entertaining movie plot. Tim, I really appreciated the list you put together of films that were inspired by Them. Why don't you run through this a little bit to provide the context of why we picked this one as opposed to any of the other ones on the list?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, like the subgenre of squarely B-movie science fiction films produced in particularly the mid-1950s. And they all revolve around, general themes of radiation, nuclear testing, and societal nuclear anxiety. And the way that these films express that is generally through the idea of giant radioactive creatures. Them is probably one of the most either famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. It's about obviously giant, 8, 10, 12-foot ants. The scale keeps changing in the film. But it's by no means the only one. So as you said, Them came out in 1954, but it was actually preceded a year before by a film. So all of these films have ridiculous titles. The first one in 1953 was called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Mm-hmm. So this was a much smaller budget. It was released by Warner Brothers, which is the same studio that made Them, and apparently it did surprisingly well. Naturally, a film makes money. Perhaps that's the reason so many imitators started coming out.
Mm-hmm. So every movie now is either The Matrix or looks like Jason Bourne.
Exactly.
What works and sells.
Exactly. So we're running through a couple of these. So Them comes out in 1954. The same year, another film came out called Monster from the Ocean Floor. So the description of that one is a woman on holiday in Mexico spots a giant one-eyed amoeba rising from the ocean. But when she tries to tell the authorities, no one believes her. She finally teams up with a marine biologist in an attempt to destroy it. 1955, another film. It Came from Beneath the Sea. A giant radioactive octopus rises from the Philippine Trench to terrorize the North American Pacific coast.
What is that called when people have a fear of something in the ocean? Is it lassophobia or...
Perfect. I don't know what it's called, but it's perfectly reasonable. The idea of swimming in open water with something beneath you and not knowing what terrifies me, and that's before they become radioactive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in 1957, you had The Amazing Colossal Man.
Mm-hmm.
A military officer survives a nuclear blast, only to begin to uncontrollably grow into an increasingly unstable giant. And 1959, you had The Giant Behemoth, where marine atomic tests caused changes in the ocean's ecosystem, resulting in dangerous blobs of radiation and the resurrection of a dormant dinosaur that threatens London.
Well, that sounds pretty familiar to the one that we kind of are leading up to here, the big one that still makes movies today,
Indeed.
Godzilla.
Exactly. Them is probably the second most famous of these kind of monster films, and contemporaneous with it was the original Japanese Godzilla, which I think we'll probably talk to a bit later, especially in comparison and similarities and differences to them. But yeah, you had Godzilla came out, Mothra in 1961, Rodan in 1956. But so there's a uniquely Japanese subgenre, obviously, but you can tell from just the brief descriptions of those films, they are almost carbon copies of each other in terms of radiation causes X creature to terrorize Y. They're all very close to each other. I think they differ quite significantly in quality of filmmaking and effects. I did try to watch as many of these as I could. Some of them are not easy to find these days, unless you want to like scour eBay and have the obscure DVD. But again, they sit. I think they also sit alongside plenty of other specifically science fiction B movies of the period. So while these films are exploring concerns about radiation and the early onset of the Cold War through this giant ant premise, at the same time you have kind of thematic cousins where it's still solidly sci-fi films, but they're approaching from a different way. So probably the most famous is the Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951.
It's a really good movie. It's a really good movie. I always enjoy that one quite a lot.
So, I mean, again, these films obviously vary significantly in quality, and that's probably the best ones are the ones that keep getting remade. So, like The Day the Earth Stood Still. That's another one where you have a science fiction premise as like an analogy for mankind's genius in creating these massive weapons and unleashing these forces of nature, but also acting at the limit of our own wisdom and capability to control them. And so they get lots of other, just general, particularly American Cold War paranoia. So that's probably reflected in films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956.
Your neighbor's a communist, you might just not know.
I mean, exactly. I mean, that's a bit McCarthyist and probably a little less knowingly, well, it's certainly not subtle or intelligent. But again, it's this idea of science fiction being used to hold up a prism to society. And although the premise might be silly or outrageous, there's something interesting underneath it that, it definitely... It's an interesting snapshot of what was society concerned about at the time and how is that being reflected back through this very popular medium. I think just a final honorable mention as well is again probably the most infamous is Attack of the 50-Foot Woman from 1958, which I've got. So I did find this one. I started watching it. Man, it's so bad. It's such a bad movie. It's not just the filmmaking, it's so deeply, terribly misogynist. It was really hard to watch, and I ended up pretty much skipping. For a film called Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, there's only like 10 minutes of Attack of a 50-Foot Woman, and it's all at the very end of the movie, and that's on YouTube. So I would direct people, if you're in any way interested, go watch that scene, and you'll also pretty much get the tone and sexism of the movie from that. I think that's interesting, not only because it's kind of an infamous film, but that film doesn't directly address nuclear weapons fears, but the same way, the reason the woman becomes 50 foot tall is she's somehow exposed to radiation. I think it's interesting that. So that's 1958. By then, audiences, and the film really doesn't make any attempt to explain how she has mutated and become so big, but I think it highlights, it's tapping into a vernacular that has already been very well established by all these other films of, radiation is this terrifying and kind of unknown, almost mystical force. Oh, maybe it just makes things giant. Whatever. Don't think about it too deeply. But by then, that idea has probably so much currency that the film doesn't feel like it needs to explain it very much. And I think that's because of films like them and Godzilla having this quite wide reach.
One of the things I think we'll talk about as we go through this, so I really appreciate the framework that you created here which is a good foundation because, there are definitely some of these movies where radiation is simply just a plot device. It's simply just a MacGuffin. It's the thing to make the other thing big. We could squish these bugs, but now they can squish us, and it's because of unknown radiation stuff. But then you got some films within this that talk about the monsters are not the end of the film itself. They are a means to reflect on dangers of nuclear weapons, dangers of the Cold War. And it's a way to tell people, like all good sci-fi, it's a way to tell people a story about something that's deeper, but using things that are a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more familiar. Even giant monsters, as they're not really familiar, but it's something that's approachable for someone to be able to, a vehicle to get to a very complex subject, because not every movie can be Threads and just show you the brutality of, fortunately, not every movie is like that. But that's one thing that Godzilla, the original Godzilla, did so well, that maybe the other ones don't really care about.
Yeah, different crew, different filmmakers come in. They perhaps don't share the same priorities, and this language has already been established, as you say. It's funny how sometimes these franchises lose their way, or they just become straight up monster action films, and they forget the philosophical or metaphorical aspect, and then you get a reboot and it comes back to that, or it doesn't. It's interesting how these same stories can sometimes get retold in very different way. I would love to see a remake of them, see what it would be about now.
I was going to ask at the very end, like, why has this one not been remade?
Yes.
But speaking of the particular qualities that a filmmaker and their crew bring, this particular movie, Them, was directed by Gordon Douglas, who had a long career in B movies and low budget films. He also directed an interesting 1957 movie called Bombers B-52, which was about Strategic Air Command setting up a couple of new planes, and it's more of a thriller. I don't remember this film being discussed as one of the propaganda films of Strategic Air Command. There were a number of those that were made literally with like Curtis LeMay, the commander of Strategic Air Command, like kind of being the actual director. But it does tell an interesting story about that particular piece of nuclear history. And also kind of interesting, he also was in many of the Little Rascals films and TV stuff. I think he was a little bit too old to be a literal Little Rascal, but he was one of the side characters. So quite a life this person has led. A number of really great actors, stellar cast really, in the movie Them, which is super surprising. James Whitmore, who a lot of people may remember from the movie Shawshank Redemption. He's Brooks Hatlin. He's the guy who runs the library. He's got the little crow that he feeds worms to.
Yeah, this I'd seen obviously this film before, and I'd seen Shawshank Redemption many times, but I didn't connect the two until I looked it up in preparation for this, and I couldn't really believe it was it. Oh, he's got the saddest story in Shawshank Redemption.
Yep. At the end of the movie, Them, he should have wrote Brooks was here next to the giant ants or something. He was also in a movie called Give 'Em Hell, Harry, where he plays known atomic bomb user Harry S. Truman. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about his like re-election campaign or some other stuff. And it's like a one-man play type deal. But anyways, I thought another interesting. That's what I look for when I look at these things. Another actor from this movie, James Arness, who was famous from Gunsmoke, but also was in the original The Thing. So not James Carpenter's The Thing, which is one of the best sci-fi movies of all time, but the original, The Thing from Another World. And then a few other famous people like Edmund Gwenn, who played Santa Claus in Miracle on 34th Street, and wait for it later, a cameo by Leonard Nimoy.
So I'm a massive Star Trek fan, and I don't believe I have seen this film several times. I never realized that was him. And other than the TV show Fringe, I also don't think I've ever seen Leonard Nimoy in anything else. At least not acting. When you tweeted me, and I immediately had to go and find the clip again. It's a very young, very handsome Spock.
I only looked for it because I read the Wikipedia page and it said he was there, so I kept an eye out for it. This movie was very, very popular for a 1950s film. It was nominated for an Oscar for its special effects. It won a Golden Reel Award for Best Sound Editing. It's the highest grossing film, or one of the highest grossing films for Warner Brothers in 1954. And if you go on Rotten Tomatoes, even though Rotten Tomatoes didn't exist, the internet didn't exist back then, it's scored now as 100%, which is not many. I mean, most Best Pictures winners for the Oscars don't get 100%.
So I mean, the social scientist in me think there's an element of self-selection there,
Sure.
in that if you're going to go out of your way to review a film from, 70 years ago, it's probably because you enjoy it and you want to write a review. It'd be odd to go back and trash it, but you're right. It is fondly remembered for lots of different reasons, including the quality of the filmmaking, which definitely makes a good difference to some of these other films.
Oh,
that
for
were
sure.
released at the same time.
Execution matters quite a lot. Rotten Tomatoes summarizes it as one of the best creature features of the early atomic age. Them features effectively menacing special effects and avoids a self-parody that would later taint later monster movies. I think that certainly is very true. And, where I go to for old movies, Turner Classic Movies, the website calls it a quintessential atomic age creeper, which I think is a good thing. But yeah, so we've talked a lot about what the film is and kind of the culture and the context, the round of which it came out. Let's get into the film itself. I don't know why I have to say this, but spoiler warning, if you haven't seen this movie from 1954 yet, go on, check it out. It's not available widely on YouTube, so you're going to have to rent it. I rented it from Amazon Prime. I don't know how you watched it, Tim.
I had a DVD copy from back in my undergrad days when I first discovered nukes as a topic that you could actually research.
Mm-hmm.
And I got quite into nuclear culture, and facilitated in part by a professor who was interested in the social aspects. And I was hoovering up all the films and books I could. I was reading on the beach, and I spent 2 months of just finding everything I could. And I love films from the 50s and 60s. That's my period of history that I research as well. So yeah, this film was made for me.
Perfect. Well, how about you take the driver's seat here on the right side of the car and drive us through the plot here.
Yeah, well, so in terms of the overall plot, I mean, you really can kind of summarize it from the IMDb type description of, or if the modern poster, which features a giant ant and some people, you kind of know what you're going to get. It is a straightforward plot. So the film is set roughly 9 years, so it's contemporaneous with its release in 1953, 1954. It's set so 9 years after the first atomic bomb test at the Trinity site
in New Mexico, the southwest of the United States.
And the film opens with the New Mexico State Police, an aircraft and a ground vehicle are conducting a search. And I thought it was quite a good opening for a film in that you just start in the middle of a scene, and it's not spoon-feeding anything. And these two officers in a car, so Sergeant Peterson, played by James Brooks, as I can only think of him.
I might just call him Brooks throughout the entirety of this.
Exactly. He and his colleague are conducting a missing person search, and they find a very young girl walking alone through the desert, carrying a doll, and she's traumatized and almost catatonic.
What are you doing out here, honey? Honey? What's your name? Who do you belong to?
And that leads them to search where she come from. And within the space of 10 minutes, we find out the trailer that she had been staying in with her family, and the trailer has been ripped apart like it was, just made of cardboard.
But important thing, ripped apart from the inside.
Inside.
Someone, it wasn't like a car ran into it. Like something got out.
Yes, indeed. And around the scene, so they can't find any bodies. They see some bloody clothes. And other than that, there's a gun, but it doesn't seem like there's been a robbery because the money is left in the trailer. And the other quintessentially warning sign is that there is sugar packets dotted all over the place.
Interesting.
So this doesn't seem like your run-of-the-mill robbery or attack, certainly.
It's clearly the bad guy from the Men in Black movie who runs around asking for sugar and sugar water. I think it must be him.
Well, he was an insect, so, I mean...
It all works out, right? Giant cockroach type thing. If anyone's seen the movie Aliens, if you've seen Newt, that the little girl that hides from the aliens there, that kind of catatonic stare is really, I obviously it's not the same actress. And I think I pulled open Google to search. I'm like, oh, obviously it clearly isn't. Those movies are 50, 60 years apart. But they almost look very identical. Like they typecasted Newt as the girl from Them. Anyways, I couldn't get past that point.
Yeah, well, again, it's probably this idea of these early science fiction films establish a language that we then just become familiar and just keep. It's an easy thing for filmmakers to reference, and you just kind of accept it.
One of the things I read, and I don't know if this is true, but it was in a book about when I was searching for things about the movie Them, said that the contemporary reviews and the way this movie was marketed, the ant reveal, the fact that there's a giant ant, was not known to the public. And that people, when they entered this film, thought they didn't know what to expect, at least for the first couple of weeks. The movie treats the rest of this at the beginning of the film like a regular police investigation. They think there might be some kind of crazed killer going around murdering people, and who's also obsessed with sugar or something, and that the contemporary reviews didn't reveal it like in the headlines or anything like that. I don't know if that's true because we've seen the movie poster for this, but that may have been a movie poster created after the film.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't know if that's 100% true, but it's fun to pretend that people didn't know that this was about giant ants.
So I didn't know that either until you emailed me that. So you watch the film thinking the audience knows something the characters don't, so it's kind of enjoyable seeing the character. You want to go, of course it's a giant ant. Haven't you ever seen a giant ant rip open a trailer? So you're kind of waiting for the characters to get there. And so they start spotting other warning signs, like they see a giant animal print that doesn't look like any animal print that they know.
No cat ever lived leave a print like that.
Maybe something was set down there. Bag or can or something like that.
Yeah, could be almost anything.
And then they hear this high-pitched like chirping noise or like a screech from the desert.
Which causes the little girl to sit up and have scary eyes for a little while.
She's just bolt upright in the car, and it's the only reaction they get out of her. So, in your mind, you're like, oh, it's the giant ants.
What was that?
I don't know.
Must have been the wind. It's pretty freakish in these parts.
Yeah.
Realize it's a giant ant, so you're in danger. But I can imagine how it would have played differently if you had no idea. If you could sit someone down cold, and maybe get a friend, sit them down who hasn't heard the podcast, and watch this and see what they think it is. Maybe that'd be a way to replicate that initial surprise.
Yeah, it's hard to pull yourself out of the current time that you're in. And one of the ways that I've seen that is, when they call in the crime scene investigators to check out fingerprint stuff and get the footprint all casted up so they can look at it. All these crime scene investigators, again, we're in the middle of a desert, a very hot desert. They're all wearing suits and ties and like wool suits. And
I mean, it's no worse than like CSI Miami, where they look like they've just come off the catwalk, and they're not worried about contaminating the scene in any way.
Yeah. Well, I guess in the 50s you had to sacrifice comfort for style. But yeah, so we hear this kind of crazy sound. We then go to another nearby like convenience store, which is like Gramps Johnson's General Store.
This store looks like the kind of place you would find in one of the Fallout video games.
Exactly.
So it's like a cabin, it's isolated, there's lootable items everywhere, and it's been ransacked. And in classic Fallout style, actually, there's a body in the back of the shop, and Gramps is no more.
In classic Fallout style, they had we talked about this when we did our episode on the Fallout video game series for the podcast. There is in Fallout 3, there is a mission called Those, with an exclamation mark. Yep, which is about fire breathing giant ants. So they step their game up a little bit there. So they find the body. They also find a bunch of sugar, piles of bales of sugar that people have gotten into. One of the cops leaves to go file the report and get some help, but they leave one cop behind, and he hears the loud noises. You kind of see him go off camera, fire a few shots. He screams. He hears the squeaky sound again. And I guess he gets eaten. So what do they think? They think there's a cop killing crazy psychopath who's obsessed with sugar and clearly is like roided out or on a PCP or something.
And this all happens the time. I think this is 14 minutes into the movie. I mean, to the film, it doesn't waste any time. It is quite. The beginning and the end of the film are both quite quickly paced. It's quite effective. It does get you into. It's funny because you've said that they didn't know about the ants. I can only now see it. Oh, if you're viewing this as a mystery, and you're right, this could just be like a serial killer type thing. But obviously, you watch this now, you're going, of course, it's giant ants.
Right.
But so within 14 minutes, there's already been two attacks, 2 deaths. One of the 3 characters we've been introduced to is already dead. We've already heard twice this horrific kind of screeching noise that's going to be played several times throughout the film, which is spoiler, being made by the ants as a means of communication, and it's genuinely actually I find quite creepy.
Yeah, I saw here that the sound is a recorded chorus of bird-voiced tree frogs, and this particular whistling sound was used in a bunch of other giant monster movies like The Black Scorpion from 1957, and I don't know what this one's about, but Mohawk, probably pretty scary. Sounds scary to me.
It makes it sound less scary when you find out what it actually is, and then the Foley artist is their thing.
Yeah.
It's like in Jurassic Park, I think the original sound of the raptors, the engineers took it from a video clip of turtles mating, and then they did magic tricks on the computer, and then it makes this terrifying raptor noise. But now you watch Jurassic Park, you think, oh yeah, that's turtles copulating.
Yeah.
It's suddenly less scary.
My favorite examples of that are the T-Rex from that movie is, I believe it's an alligator bellowing, which if you go to YouTube and search alligators bellowing, it's frightening. But it's very similar to that. And my other favorite is, blasters from Star Wars is a metal high tension wire hitting with a stick, and it sounds like a blaster, which you can recreate for yourself. And this is all created by Ben Burt, sound Foley artist. But the other one I really like is, I believe the TIE Fighter sound is tires on a wet pavement mixed with an elephant roar, and they combine those two things, which you probably wouldn't combine in real life.
I mean, who wouldn't think to combine this?
Terrifying sounds in the movie Them. And I think the other interesting thing with this police investigation is that they get the autopsy of Gramps Johnson. There's a lot of formic, I think it's pronounced formic acid, inside of him, which is found in bee and ant stingers, also in the preservation of livestock feed, toilet bowl cleaners, and producing rubber. But anyways, it's weird that this whatever killer is going around is having a hypodermic needle stabbing people with formic acid.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think it's the cops aren't unreasonable to leap to the idea of it's giant mutated ants.
Sure,
they just stumbled across the weirdest career-making serial killer case of all time.
But they bring in the FBI because of a convenience little situation. Is that I guess the owner of the RV was also an FBI agent, so they want to bring him in or bring in someone from the FBI, and it happens to be FBI agent Bob Graham from the Alamogordo office. And longtime podcast listeners have probably heard us talk about Alamogordo, New Mexico, which was the site of the first nuclear test that Tim mentioned earlier, the Trinity test from July 16th, 1945. So the Alamogordo office of the FBI, of which I would love to see if it actually does exist.
It's not a big place, right?
Like Alamogordo is not very big at all.
So this guy maybe it's like one room, and this is the first time his phone has actually rung, and he's actually
nice. But they need some help.
Things you can't pick up as a British person watching this. I know some of the names, but it's this kind of detail.
Well, they need some help, so they send out the footprint for help, because I don't know why they would bring this footprint out. I guess maybe they think it could be at that point some kind of animal attack. But they send for help from Washington. The Department of Agriculture sends in Dr. Harold Medford and his daughter, Dr. Pat Medford, who are very, very smart people that know a lot about, I guess, bugs, those kind of things.
I think they're just referred to as zoologists.
It's very funny to think that in this movie in the 1950s, the best experts about zoologists are in government and not like nowadays it would be someone like from the university or something. It wouldn't be from government
Well,
because
is that 1950s maybe I'm reading too much into this, pre-Watergate faith in government, maybe.
Yeah, it could be.
They have the best people.
Well, they have the best people, but our heroes who are not really the best people. When the second Dr. Medford appears as a woman, and it's this big surprise, a big reveal. Our character comes down, Dr. Medford, and her skirt gets stuck on the airplane ladder, and all of our heroes like blush and God, can you believe this? And there's this interesting little exchange here where the cop says,
He's quite a doctor, huh?
Yeah. She's the kind that takes care of sick people. I think I'll get a fever real quick.
these are our heroes.
It's clanging sexism. This is probably something we return to as a recurrent theme throughout the film, and definitely I think the most bum note in the whole film. But I mean, we literally are introduced to she's one of the main characters, one of like the heroes of the film, and we see her first by leering at her ankles. I mean, this was the 50s, so there was the style at the time, and all the ground crew are kind of leering at her as she walks by, and the men's faces as they share a look of like, oh my god, a lady doctor, dames. I mean, it's uncomfortable to watch, and then they explicitly do make that ha 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 joke about I'll get real sick real quick, and it's like, are we meant to find this funny? I think we're meant to be on their side. I mean, it's not like we're setting this up as some kind of adversity that she's going to overcome. Weirdly, yes, she plays along. She gives as good as she gets, but it's all meant to be good humored and funny rather than crushingly awkward and uncomfortable.
Well, the sexism overshadows the nepotism, because how can a father and daughter end up working in the same government branch at the same time? Maybe they're both experts, but there's something fishy there. I don't know what's going on there. Fishy zoology. There's something there. So Dr. Medford is back at the police station, and he's reading the coroner's report on old Gramps Johnson, and he starts to he looks at the formic acid and he starts to formulate a theory, and he asks,
in what area was the atomic bomb exploded? I mean the first one, back in 1945.
It was right here in the same general area. White Sands.
1945. That's 9 years ago. Yes, genetically, it's certainly possible.
Now, look, we're grown up. There's no need to play footsie with us. As a matter of fact, we resent it. Now, if you people know what this thing is, Doctor, I suggest you tell us. We're assigned to this case, too, you know.
Mr. Graham, we cannot tell you until we're absolutely certain of our theory.
One, the FBI agent points to the exact wrong place on the White Sands map. He points to a spot that's on the other side of Alamogordo, where the nuclear test took place. But whatever, it's not hundreds of miles away, but it's not that important. But that's also now, it was later referred to as the White Sands Proving Ground, where the nuclear tests take place. It's gone back and forth with a couple different names. It was used for World War II bombing tests, and eventually was where the nuclear site was for the first test. The doctor, though, is very mysterious. He keeps saying things like, it could be genetically possible and all of this, but he doesn't say it's ants. It's clearly some kind of radioactive ant. He keeps that a mystery for just himself.
Yeah, but he's clearly come with, he's already convinced somehow, just by looking at a plaster cast of an unknown animal, that of course it's an ant, and of course it's become giant due to nuclear testing nearby. He seems a very interesting scientist, where he's not coming in with multiple hypotheses or having an open mind. He's already convinced, but he's not sharing his theory with anyone. So yes, the two the FBI agent and the police officer have to then take him around all the different scenes of the attacks, and they're getting, understandably, I think, increasingly frustrated, where no one will tell them what their working theory is. But the Harold, the older scientist, is getting more and more aggravated as he seems to find more evidence confirming his theory.
So then he wants to go talk to the little girl. That's his next thing. He wants to talk to the witness. He goes to talk to the daughter. She's still in a catatonic state, kind of staring. He has, I don't know, I forget how this works. He has, I guess he asked for his daughter to give him some formic acid.
In a vial, yes.
Yeah, so she just carries that around, I guess. He puts it into a coffee cup, and he puts it under the girl's nose, because her nurse says that the only thing to bring her out of her state is to relive the trauma that put her there.
Yeah, I don't think this is best psychology practice.
Yeah.
But it is certainly very convenient in terms of the plot.
Yep.
Because, yes, as I said, they wave this formic acid under her nose, and she immediately perks up, and she starts screaming.
May we visit the desert now, gentlemen?
It's getting pretty late, Doctor.
Later than you think.
And there's this game of, how quickly will they mention the title of the movie in the movie? She just starts screaming, them.
Cue the horn, which I always like to play when they say the name of the movie.
Exactly. But it seemed to me like a really weird thing to script. So them implies a familiarity. It's like, oh, I don't need to say what they are. It's, oh, we've seen these things so many times, it's just them. Surely the natural thing to scream would be like, ants.
And they'll be like, quickly, call up the father's sister. The aunt. The aunt must be involved. The aunt and the uncle are attacking people.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was in the trailer. The little girl screaming them over and over again.
Oh yeah. I mean, trailers before the mid '90s are always a bit hit and miss anyway. I mean, It's weird how cutting a trailer has become like a real art form now. So you kind of watch, even a film from like the early '90s, and it's clangingly simple and naive. So I'd love to see what the trailer for 1954 B movies look like.
Exactly.
And actually, I'll maybe post a few on Twitter. Some of those other films that I couldn't find to watch, but I did find the trailers, and they are not good. I thought modern trailers are bad about giving away the ending of the films. The trailers for lots of these B movies of the period just straight up show you like the monster in the last few minutes, and that it's kind of crazy.
All right, so go check that out. People listening to the podcast, Tim's Twitter handle is @WarAndCake.
Which makes sense if you know me. I write about war, and I also do a lot of baking.
It all
it is objectively silly, and I do wonder if that's going to follow me around my professional career. But you can't say, I'm not consistent in my in my branding. You'll get what you expect.
Just be careful when you're doing all that baking. You don't leave sugar around, because then your two professions will also your two interests will come and combine to you in a different way. All right, so the scientist has talked to the little girl. He's seen the autopsy report. They think he's got a theory, but now he wants to go back to the scene of the crime. So they go out into the desert, and then what happens then? They put the goggles on, they go check out the crime scene, and then them appear. But who is them?
I don't know if anyone, if you ever watched From Dusk Till Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
So I watched that film once when I was way too young, but it was on really late at night. I didn't know anything about it. So that film starts like a straightforward, like Western road movie. It's got Tarantino, and you're 45 minutes in, it's like, all right, this is fine, but it's so much so standard criminal fare. And then all of a sudden, that film, Salma Hayek turns into a vampire and rips off Quentin Tarantino's head. Mm-hmm. And I remember watching that, having no idea what the film was about, going, what did I just see?
That was my same experience.
Straightforward, like, vampire monster movie. Them does something similar. So the first 25 minutes of this film are straightforward police procedural. And there's a few weird things. But there's, and you've had this non-diegetic sound of like the ant screaming, but you haven't seen the source of it. So it's, non-diegetic, it's off screen. Scientists, the police, they go to the original crime scene. What's happening? What's going on? You hear the sound again, and all of a sudden, what's that coming over the hill? It is a giant, they say it's 10-foot giant ant. And this is, I think, one of the interesting notes is this isn't done like lots of films at the time, like miniatures and stop motion animation. They filmed this with a full scale, I suppose you'd call it a puppet, because, as it moves, the legs move. But I was reading apparently so it wasn't like there's a person inside it. This ant couldn't move on its own, but they do some camera trickery. Apparently it's on a dolly and the legs move independently. So
it's an animatronic atomic ant.
Right. Terrifying. But you watch it, okay, it's a practical effect, but for the standards of the time, it's not the worst.
Yeah.
This is pretty giant, quite gross-looking ant appears over the hill and starts to look like it's going to attack Patricia, so the female doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And our heroes leap into action. They start shooting the ant, and the older doctor goes, "No, shoot the antennae. That's how it sees." And
Get the antennae! Get the antennae!
I think at one point, Brooks, as I'm going to now just call him, he suddenly magics up a machine gun that appears from nowhere.
Like
And anyway,
he goes back to the car and gets a Tommy gun, basically.
Oh, that was okay.
Yeah.
It looked to me like in a video game. He's cycling through triangle.
Yeah.
He fired a pistol, then all of a sudden he has a machine gun.
The FBI agent has a handgun that he never had on him at all at any point beforehand. So that magic gun does appear a little bit.
Movie logic. But anyway, so they managed to fend off the ant by shooting it in the antennae a lot, and the ant falls down dead. And that's like, so 25 minutes into the film, that's where you finally have the reveal of them as being these giant, quite gross ants.
One of the family Formicidae. An ant.
An ant? I don't believe it. It's not possible.
A fantastic mutation. Probably caused by lingering radiation from the first atomic bomb. Notice its odor?
Yeah. Formic acid? Well, then that's why that little girl reacted so violently. And the coroner's report said that Gramps was filled with the stuff.
See that?
Not a big fan of bugs anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But you ever see like pictures of bugs under microscopes, and they are, suddenly a small little housefly that you wouldn't think twice about suddenly looks incredibly gross and horrific. There's the same thing. That there's a general element of creepiness, despite all it's a bit ropey 1950s effects, but when you see this giant ant with its huge antennae and everything, I got a little bit weirded out. I did not enjoy it, and I don't think it's just because I don't like bugs.
I didn't want to frighten you, but I can see behind you on the Skype video there's a caterpillar. No, it's all good.
Basically any bug that's like larger than a centimeter, and I will suddenly vacate the room. I don't know what it is.
Yep.
No time to lose. We must find the colony, the nest. You mean there's more of them?
This was probably just a scout foraging for food. You heard the sound. The stridulation. It communicated with others in the colony.
Communicate? You mean these things sent messages?
Of course. All insects have means of communication with their own kind.
So they're looking for them because they're bigger than a centimeter or whatever. They get in a helicopter and they fly around looking for basically like an anthill or where the colony would be. So the doctor worries there might be hundreds, potentially thousands of these giant ants. So they go looking for the nests. They want to kill the ants before there's a national panic. Like that's one of the major underlining themes here is they don't want to tell the world that there are these ants. Otherwise, people will, I guess, pretty reasonably freak out. I'd probably freak out if I was told there's a bunch of ants that could take over the world. But yeah, they find the ant hole. You'd see this funny scene of an ant coming out of the hole, and it has a human rib cage, like an intact human rib cage.
It's been stripped clean of all flesh and organs, but somehow the rib cage is holding together as one like whole entity. It doesn't fall apart in any way as a rib cage actually would.
Now, I would understand that if there were thousands of little ants eating a rib cage, because then the individual ants aren't like pulling apart the rib itself. But these are giant monster ants. I don't know how they eat without tearing it apart.
Very fine motor skills, apparently. They picked the bones literally clean, but they've also somehow kept the rib cage intact, and so you see skulls and that kind of thing. So just so there's no ambiguity about what happened to the missing family and so forth, they have been picked clean by this giant nest of ants.
So now they need to go into action, and the U.S. Air Force, of course, their plan is to bomb the nest. They want to just blow it to smithereens. No discussion at any point whether or not to use nuclear weapons against the ants. I wonder if that would have been kind of what we would have done today. Probably, I don't know. Maybe it would have come up as a plan, D or C or something. But instead, the plan here is so complicated. Use bazookas to fire phosphorus grenades to heat up the surface of the already hot desert floor so that the ants who don't like the heat and only hunt at night stay underground. So then, you would throw in cyanide grenades to kill the ants in their nest so that they don't try to bury themselves or go away or anything else like that. Very, very complicated.
Is this a film that's very concerned with weapons of mass destruction and the threat in the environment? They immediately jump to using white phosphorus and cyanide gas.
Yep.
So we're fine with chemical weapons, but just nuclear weapons are the bad ones.
It's all good. I did also read on the internet, and I'm not an ant expert in any way, that cyanide, the particular chemical that cyanide, how it works on the human body and works on other plant and animal life, doesn't work on ants. Like that chemical doesn't affect them at all.
Who has tried? Like someone has just got really frustrated with ants in their kitchen, and they've gone right cyanide. We are escalating.
Yep. So I don't know if that's true or not. I just Googled, does cyanide work on ants? And that was the result that came up. But yeah, I mean, it seems like it works. Like they throw the grenades down and then they go in to check to see if there are any ants left. They bring flamethrowers and everything.
This is one of the weirdest aspects I found of the film. So our heroes in the film are generally a police officer and an FBI agent, and they're two scientist advisors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they do this thing with like, they don't want to tell the public, and perhaps they want to keep this a secret. Fine. The assault on the ant nest is suddenly led by the two police officers who are now in army uniforms, operating bazookas and carrying flamethrowers. At no point is it questioned why are they like this. Literally just a local police sergeant is suddenly being deputized and is apparently proficient in all combined arms that the US Army has at the time.
So here's why I would say that's reasonably okay. Is it was after World War II. Probably he was drafted. There's maybe a case there to be made, but I don't know.
Maybe. So they're sent into the ant nest to verify that all the ants are dead, and they're in like full hazmat gear and everything else.
No, not full hazmat gear. They're only wearing gas masks, which is weird because cyanide gas is absorbed also through the skin.
Right.
And they have full parts of their body that are exposed to the skin. Anyways, I just want to point that out, that they should have, if there's still cyanide gas in there and it hasn't seeped away into either way, they should have gotten sick from that, but not important. Radioactivity causes giant monsters. Doesn't matter.
Holes in the film about giant radioactive ants, but it's these little details. I was watching, going, really, you're not even just going to have some backup on your assault team? You're just sending in the two local police officers and the female scientist who you've gone out of your way to denigrate because the scientist says she has to go with them to verify. They don't know what they're looking for. Cue another hilarious scene where the FBI agent gets to be condescending and basically explicitly says, "This is no place for a woman."
Mm-hmm.
And again, are we meant to find this funny or are we not? But this team of totally qualified people go into the ant nest to verify that all the ants are dead. Then they eventually stumble across one cavern, however, that wasn't properly sealed. And a couple of live ants break through the walls. Two heroes leap into action with flamethrowers towards the ants. And actually, to be fair, I thought this was quite an impressive action sequence. I mean, they're real, proper flamethrowers, really burning a life-size ant. I mean, obviously, this is in the days before health and safety and I don't know, probably unions.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a decent little bit of action, I thought.
I think I read that the people who were actually using the flamethrowers were former military or current military that were trained on how to use them, and that's why you would see them with the face mask on, so they could be another actor.
You'd hope they wouldn't just strap on we're going to do this as the last scene of the film. Just put it on the star, and if anything goes wrong, it's the last scene anyway.
I think Brooks is up for it. Maybe that's why he's in prison, is because he accidentally burned someone down.
Backstory.
Could be. They find this cave, right? And there's eggs in there, and two of them have already hatched. And they're pretty sure that those are winged queen ants that escaped with some male ants. So I guess some background here is that
these two empty egg cases contain queen ants. You see, newborn queen ants have wings. You found no ants with wings?
Not a one.
The brutal fact is we didn't destroy this first nest soon enough. No. Two young queen ants hatched out, dried their wings and flew away. Each with one or more winged males. They're gone on their wedding flight. We needn't worry about the males because they'll die very quickly. But the queens...
Doctor, are you telling us there are going to be other nests?
A single queen is capable of laying thousands of eggs. From these will hatch dozens of other queens who may, in turn...
Yeah, our experts, so there's several like briefing scenes follow this as like the government kicks into action, but the threat for the rest of the movie is established where one of the scientists says that within a year humanity will be extinct because the ants will breed so quickly that then they will replicate, and once they finish by eating all the vegetable matter, they'll eat the people, and ants will rule over the earth. And there's a funny scene where the scientist, who's been strictly scientific all the way through, and he's talking about genetic mutations and so forth, he suddenly slips into biblical prophecy.
Yeah. We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true. And there shall be destruction and darkness come upon creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth.
But effectively, it sets up the rest of the movie. So now we have we've seen the ants, and we've seen the threat that they pose, and the rest of the film has set out its stall. It's about tracking down these two queen ants that have escaped, and if we don't find them within the space of a year, they could breed, and the whole planet will be overrun by giant ants.
Unless these queens are located and destroyed before they've established thriving colonies and can produce, heaven alone knows how many more queen ants, man, as the dominant species of life on Earth, will probably be extinct within a year, Doctor.
The rest of the movie takes place over the next couple of months, or weeks at least. A number of quick scenes. This is where you get the various cameos or people who later went on to be famous actors, like that's the scene with Leonard Nimoy. So yeah, we see all these other extra scenes of people. Their families are attacked by ants, or there's a gentleman in Los Angeles in a mental hospital who sees what he says are like giant UFOs landing that look like ants.
I guess some of these scenes are played for like comedy. I guess some of it doesn't really translate to a modern audience.
Yeah,
but I think a couple of scenes are so strange or broad that they must have been intended to be comedic and maybe were genuinely funny at the time.
Yeah,
but 1954 humor's moved on a little bit.
I think we can run through the rest of this really quickly. The
movie does kind of drag in the middle. I mean,
does.
So you have this interesting bit at the start, big action sequence in the middle, and then at the end, and then in the middle you have this kind of just get to the point, get to the end, and it's a proper 93-minute film.
It all leads to they're pretty sure these ants have landed in the LA sewers, basically like the river runoff sewer canals, which is a real thing in Los Angeles. I remember driving past those things. They're huge canals because water conservation is a really big thing in Southern California, in particular Los Angeles. They're pretty sure that the ants have landed and are making their nest in the sewers. There are these, because you need to have an extra level of concern, there are these two missing children that the ants may have forced into the sewers, and so you're worrying about that. So then the military and the mayor and the president declare martial law in Los Angeles. And this is where there's a little bit of this Cold War, at least overt connection, is the reporters wonder why there's this press conference, and one of them jokes to the other one and says, has the Cold War gone hot?
Why is the Army sending troops into the LA area?
Yeah, and a Marine regiment from Pendleton. What's happened?
Why a special press conference at 5 o'clock on a Sunday?
Gentlemen, you'll just have to wait.
Why all these VIPs from Washington?
Has the Cold War gotten hot?
Gentlemen.
Yeah, then they announce that the ants are real, please stay home, there's a curfew, and everyone's really super concerned about this. They find where the ants are, they go to get the ants. Our main hero, Brooks, tries to save the kids, does save the kids, but is attacked by the ants and dies. There's flamethrowers, all kinds of stuff happens, and they finally destroy all of the ants. Right? Would that basically be the quick way?
I mean,
this is the point of the movie where I started to look on my phone and stop paying attention.
So the ending is quite climactic in the sense of like scale. I mean, there's a lot of extras, there's a lot of glory shots of like army equipment building up. There are many ants on screen, and there's flamethrowers and grenades, and things are collapsing. They obviously saved like a good bit of the movie's budget for this final sequence, but at the same time, it does stretch a bit because obviously they want this to be. They spend so much money, maybe, and they want to eke it out, and the film does drag a little bit. I mean, I thought it was quite impressive that they kill one of the main stars. So
Yeah.
again, so I didn't recognize the actor, as I didn't recognize him from the Shawshank Redemption, but I was reading that apparently audiences at the time would have known him as the main star of the movie, and that it was a very unusual thing for films to kill the main star. So when you think of one of the reasons Psycho was so impactful at the time is killing the main star in like the first reel. This film does save the death for like the last 5 minutes, but still, it's one of the main characters in the film. Is killed, which is it's a little. He does heroically sacrifice himself, of course, saving these two missing children subplot that comes out of nowhere. So I would say the sense of scale at the end is very good, but at the same time, I was also checking my phone because there's a lot of just shots of military looking very impressive running into sewers and not a huge amount happening in between flamethrowers.
Yeah. A lot of movie felt a little bit like real time. Like they're not editing anything here. They're
But it does lead to a great final moment. So where they have, all our main surviving cast members, including the old professor, have gathered, and there's 2 remaining ants, and they see that these ants have discarded their wings, so they're sure that this is the ones that they're looking for. And the soldiers and the FBI agent with the flamethrower start flamethrowing these ants. And as that happens, and the film has only got 30 seconds left, the old professor gets the last word. And this way, the film, that however subtle or not it might have been about what is the film really about and its specific concerns about radiation and nuclear testing, any subtlety goes immediately out of the window as the professor gets this great final speech.
Let's act this one out here. I'll be the FBI agent. You can be Dr. Harold Medford. All right. I'll decide if we do a good job, then I'll leave it. If not, well, then I'll put the audio into it. So I'm the FBI agent.
Yep.
If these ants were created because of the first atomic bomb in 1945, what about all of the others that have exploded since then?
Nobody knows, Robert. When man entered the atomic age, he opened a door into a new world. What we'll eventually find in that new world, nobody can predict.
And then
music swells. We get a scene of like the burning, thrashing ants, and then title card, the end, hard cut. Movie is over. Please exit the theater. I mean, it is not as, and I know films of the period, because the credits are at the start. All films end. Done. Lights up. But just the way it ends with this very on the nose speech about the nuclear age and the dangers of radioactivity and the sense of the unknown. It's it sounds silly to say in a film about giant radioactive ants, but it's not subtle.
It's very on the antenna, really.
Yeah. Hey.
No, the thing I liked about it was it didn't do a the end or like ... maybe then like just it'll be like the end and it will fade over an egg that they didn't see somewhere in the corner.
Michael Caine is the one about the killer bees. I forget I think Michael Caine says it's one of the worst films he ever made. It's about killer African bees or something, and the end of the film is literally this. I remember seeing it once like late night on TV. That the bees all fly away, and one character goes to Michael Caine, who's a scientist. Is that the end? And he goes, "I don't know." Film ends. And it's like, what? Just give me some resolution. It was a terrible movie.
Yeah, the end. Look behind you. That kind of thing.
Yeah, or it also reminded me of the awful Matthew Broderick Godzilla remake.
Right.
You finally sat through it. Not a great movie. And it's like, okay, but Godzilla's defeated. We've blown up Madison Square Garden, and then you see some surviving eggs. And you're like, oh, really? Are we going to do this again? At least the film doesn't do that to you. It goes to give you a definitive end. And it's like the film is going, and over to you, humanity. Will you let this be your fate, or will you actually get your act together and stop testing nuclear weapons?
Well, it does set up the premise of, because of the idea, what about all the other tests? So is it just a thing where anytime there's that level of radiation, will that cause other monster movies to start to be a thing? I mean, I think if this movie was done today, it clearly would create a an RCU, a radioactivity cinematic universe type thing. But yeah, I don't. Anyways, that's the movie. We focused a lot at the very beginning of the film and then run through the end because that's
it's quite an unevenly paced movie.
Yeah.
I will say that about it. And maybe it's limitations, but I imagine the ants were expensive.
I think they
so
did.
Perhaps
I think they made maybe 5 of them in total, so you never see more than 3 or so on the screen at any given point. You see the same one that got shot, its antenna off. You see that at the end of the film. So you see one of the ants happens to have its antenna down. It's because it's the same damn ant from earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say anyone who really likes editing could probably take the scissors to this film and reduce it to like the length of a Twilight Zone episode. You could really,
yeah.
There's a whole sequence in the middle where it's a police procedural. They obviously need to pad it out, so they put in bits of like supposedly comedic scenes. Watch the beginning, fast forward through, watch the ending, come away with a lovely little message about the dangers of atmospheric nuclear testing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that right now. Let's talk about if those dangers are founded or just movie dangers. So let's get into our nuclear discussion. Let's get super critical about this. I've got a couple points I want to talk about with you, and then if you have some things you want to add as well. Sure. So we'll talk about radiation and giant bugs. Is that real? Is that something we should be concerned about? Spoiler warning, no, but let's get into it. I want to talk about ants and insects as a metaphor in nuclear war discussions for the dangers of nuclear war, because in more serious literature, this is definitely something that reoccurs quite a lot. The only thing that would survive in a nuclear war are cockroaches. That kind of joke. Cockroaches and Mick Jagger is, I think, the joke. But yeah, so that is a real metaphor that's deployed. So I would love to talk more about that. I think it would be kind of interesting to talk a little bit about nuclear testing at Alamogordo, New Mexico, and a little bit of the history around there and how nuclear testing evolved to be a thing where people were not so concerned at the beginning, then not concerned for a while, and then a bunch of things like accidents, radiation fallout, and movies like this that have started to get people a little bit more concerned. I think you also want to talk a little bit about the world's changing relationship with nuclear weapons, not just a B-movie type plot, but how this all comes together in a real-world context and not just a fun film discussion that we're having on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, exactly. I think if I have one mission, it's to convince some of the listeners why they should perhaps take these like 1950s science fiction B movies more seriously than their ridiculous premise and often paltry budgets would perhaps lead one to view them as being a proper piece of art or even straight up history. I think when I teach about nuclear weapons, I use these kind of films as quite an important just source material for getting into the mindset of the 50s, which is also a really important piece in our changing understanding and relationship with nuclear weapons and radiation.
Cool. Well, let's get into it. All right. So radiation and giant bugs, is it real? No. All right. So next topic. But no, I mean, so there are some case studies of places where radiation has gone up in a higher level. I mean, I think radiation is one of those fascinating things that people sometimes forget about, the fact that you constantly, if you happen to be on the planet Earth, or even if you're not on the planet Earth, if you happen to be at the space station right now, you are being bombarded with radiation constantly. There's radiation from the sun. There's radiation from the concrete in your buildings. There's radiation from radon in the ground. Like, your body is always being hit by background radiation. And even radiation that you get from flying in an airplane is a pretty significantly higher dose than background radiation.
My sister's a air stewardess, and as you would expect of me when she got her job, mentioned that to her, and she's like, "Oh, great, thanks. Something else for me to be anxious about." I'm sorry, I'm a nuclear nerd. I can't help it.
You got to give her one of the little pens for Christmas that she can check her dose meter.
Yeah. Or people in Britain, if you live in either the Cotswolds or Edinburgh, because the amount of granite at those areas, you get a much higher dose of just ambient radiation, just because of what comes out of the particular geology of those regions.
Right, and so radiation is essentially, it depends on how you not depends on how you define it, but depends on what use of the word you're using.
Yeah. So in society, we get radiation and radioactivity mixed up and used quite interchangeably.
Right. So radiation, when people think about it in terms of the bomb, it's because either a heavy element is being broken apart into smaller elements. So uranium and plutonium are fairly heavy in the sense that they have lots of individual protons. They're fairly heavy elements, and that's why they're easy to fission, to break apart, because it takes a lot of energy to hold those elements together, and those are the ones that are generally unstable. And either you put a neutron into them and can break apart the atom itself and split it into, it doesn't just disappear, it basically just transmutates. But the bond that's holding those elements together to form a piece of uranium gets released, and that gets released in the form of energy, but also an element of radioactivity comes out of that. So it could be alpha particles or beta particles or gamma particles or neutrons, things that sometimes cause a lot of problems. Like neutrons are pretty nasty if they were to hit you at a high level. Gamma radiation is pretty bad. And what it does, or things like alpha particles, which can be blocked pretty simply by your skin or clothing.
Yeah. But if you ingest them, then they can't get out of your body. So the famous example in Britain of the Russian who was poisoned with polonium in his tea. I can't remember if it's alpha or beta radiation that polonium gives off, but because it was inside his system, all this radiation wasn't being blocked by his skin, but rather was being kept in his body, and so he was poisoned by it. It was pretty grisly, but it just shows how something that wouldn't normally have been that much of a threat to the human body, when it was ingested, all of a sudden it was literally lethal.
And it's lethal because the energy that's being released, it can get into literally in the atoms of your body, the cellular structure, and it can destroy the cells. It can destroy DNA. It can cause DNA, your code of your body of this cell says it's going to produce itself and reproduce, and it serves this function. And if you combine a bunch of them together, you get a heart, or you get your bones and those kind of things. But what happens with radiation is it causes that structure to become corrupted, or at least not how you want it to be. So it can cause it to reproduce rapidly, which causes cancer, or it can cause them to fail, and then your bodily functions can break down. Or, I guess, and this is essentially mutations, it can cause your cells to say, I'm going to become a giant ant now. And it can cause growth. That's what the premise is that because radiation can affect your DNA, but traditionally in a way that causes you to become sick or ill or infertile or things like that. And that's kind of what people in science fiction has said. We've seen mutations happen. This must be something that could happen if it's just calibrated correctly, or happen to be, I guess, in this situation, unlucky. But there are examples of this. You can see places like where there are nuclear power accidents, like at Chernobyl or Fukushima, and you can go to those places and see where there's a continual release of radiation, either high level, like in Chernobyl near the containment site, or Fukushima in Japan, where it's relatively low in the surrounding area, but pretty bad at the actual site itself. You can go to those places and see how radiation has affected plant and animal life. And one of the doctors who is in the Department of Biology at the University of South Carolina, or me being from Southern California, calls it the fake USC, Dr. Timothy Masao studies these issues, and his research has looked at animal populations, and essentially his conclusion is these populations are teetering, his words, on the brink of extinction and continue to suffer. Instead of producing giant ants, his research has shown that there's severe genetic damage, reduced survival capabilities of the affected populations, seen a lot of cataracts in the eyes of the animals, smaller brain sizes, reduced fertility of the animals because they're no longer able to produce normally. In birds, they're irregularly sized, they have stunted plumage in terms of their feathers. And his conclusion is the big effect is going to be having populations that are unhealthy and less fit, less able to deal with changes in the environment, less able to repopulate. Much different than producing amazing, like X-Men level genetic mutations. It's really mostly tends to be not great.
Yeah, it's one of the bleaker aspects of studying the idea of nuclear war and thinking about what would come after is the idea of not only would some people survive, you'd be surviving in this, especially if it was a large exchange, this irradiated area in which people would persist for quite a long time and nature would persist. And okay, in the very, very, very long span of history, I'm sure nature would find a way to cope and adapt and that kind of thing. But for the people who lived in that area, okay, maybe if you got acute radiation sickness, you'd die quickly. But for everyone else, you would carry on and the people would reproduce and you would have offspring. And it would just be this gradual process of deterioration and suffering, whether it's physical or as I say, the effect of like brain development and that kind of thing. And call back to that previous episode we did on threads, which tried to show that in a very small period of time. But
and they mentioned in that particular movie, they mentioned cataracts. That was an explicit thing that people mentioned, is that people are becoming increasingly blind with the ozone, and it combined that with the ozone layer being destroyed. People are going blind at an early age.
Yeah, as I was when I read about these things, that's one of the most thing that sticks with you. It's like the most lasting and bleak ideas. The idea of mankind through its own genius and folly, it manages to pollute the whole planet to the extent of all living things, including even plants, would be permanently changed and poisoned by this environment. And it wouldn't just be, you will have evolution and some of them will learn to carry on. It's just that a lot of living things would just have shorter, more miserable lifespans. Go humanity, well done.
Well, that's definitely a dark story. I'm going to pair this with a little bit of a fun story that I found here in the course of the research that shows, again, this nature adapting piece, but a little less bleak. Although, I guess if you can be the judge of this when the story is over. So I found this article in a British paper. So it starts literally with the line, "Keep calm and carry on building." That's the motto of 100,000 or so wood ants stranded without food in a nuclear bunker until they starve. Fun way to start this story. And what it is there was an abandoned nuclear weapons storage bunker in Poland that was once used by the Soviet Union. And there is a colony of wood ants living without light, near freezing temperatures, and no access to any food source. And these scientists who were going there looking at something else saw this huge colony of ants and wondering, how are they surviving? There's no queen ants, there's no male ants, they're all worker ants, and there's no food or light or anything. So in 2013, when these ants were discovered, turns out what they were doing was there was a ventilation pipe that was feeding air into the bunker. It was normally the air only air can flow in, and nothing can flow. No radioactivity can flow in. It kind of usually depends if it has a little hat on top of it, a little pipe. The ants were falling into the ventilation pipe because the vent top rusted out. The ants built a huge anthill on top of it, and it just happened to be that every once in a while ants would fall down into the hole, and they could crawl up the walls, but none of them can crawl horizontally across the ceiling, so they couldn't get out. So they would fall in, there was no food or anything, so eventually the ants would die. They fall in, they starve, but their instincts were so strong, they decided just to keep building. So they built their colony, which is estimated to be upwards of 2 million dead ants, is the foundation of this. And this would end. It should collapse, but because there's so many ants that keep falling through the rusted pipe on accident, they keep replacing themselves and they keep surviving. Essentially, there's no queen ant, there's no food source, there's nothing. So unlike the ants in them, there's no queen. It's just an endless stream of doomed worker ants building a colony in the dark until each of them starve to death.
Merry Christmas, everyone. We're recording this on the 15th of December.
Yeah, sorry, I thought this would be a fun story, but obviously it being a former nuclear weapons site, there's no bombs there, there's no radioactivity or anything, but it is an interesting place where ants have found a home, I guess, for
feels very much
for this.
Sorry, Dr. Malcolm, but life doesn't really always find a way necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it finds a way if you just keep having lemmings
feeding
falling
it
over
from an external, non-closed environment.
Yeah. I just find that story so interesting. I'll link to in my recommendations of stuff to read afterwards. I'll link to it.
It's funny, so you mentioned that shorthand that we have after nuclear war. The only thing that would survive would be cockroaches. I mean, so I'm very much a social scientist rather than proper scientist, and I don't know if you can answer this, but I know I have definitely read that apparently that is also a complete myth. So not only would they be vulnerable to the same radioactive polluted environments, but apparently cockroaches have evolved to basically live off human waste. At least the ones that we think of, and in terms of the size and numbers, same as rat. So that if humanity died off, apparently so too would the populations, if not completely, then at least significantly. So the idea of like this irradiated wasteland just populated by like rats and cockroaches, apparently that is itself maybe a useful shorthand for like anti-nuclear weapon campaigners, but it is also a complete myth, because these are basically parasitic species that rely on the waste of industrialized human societies. So if you take away that society, you also take away, everything that is on the other trophic layers beneath us.
Well, that's really interesting, and that's a terrific segue into the next point that I wanted to raise, because it does try to deploy that metaphor. So there's a terrific book and a series of articles and everything written by Jonathan Schell, Schell, who was an American writer and thinker, activist on nuclear issues, environmental issues, human rights issues. For many years, he wrote for The New Yorker for a number of years. An article that he wrote called Republic of Insects and Grass from 1982 in The New Yorker eventually got put into a book with a couple of other writings called The Fate of the Earth. It was one of the first books that I read on this topic in high school on nuclear issues, and it's so well written. It's one of the best written works in terms of prose and combining very bleak details and well-written structure of how he writes, but also the scientific details in a very approachable way. And he deploys this metaphor as a powerful description of what the consequences of nuclear war are. So let me just read through this really quickly. It's like 2 paragraphs, and then we can then discuss kind of what that means and then get into the issue of the science of it. He says that the one class of animals containing a number of species quite likely to survive a nuclear attack, at least the short run, is the insect class, for which in most known cases the lethal doses lie between 2,000 rads and about 100,000 rads. Insects, therefore, would be destroyed selectively. Unfortunately, for the rest of the environment, many of the most phytophagous species, insects that feed directly on vegetation, have very high tolerances, and therefore would be expected to survive disproportionately, and then to multiply greatly in the aftermath of an attack. The demise of their natural predators, the birds, would enhance their success. Since grass also has a fairly high tolerance for radiation, Schell concludes that after a nuclear war, it appears that at the outset, the United States would become a republic of insects and grass, which is a very powerful metaphor for imagining what war would do to the world. 'Cause that's something you can bleakly picture. I've seen images of just grasslands and insects, and that's all that's left of the United States or of the world. That paints a powerful picture, and it's one of those things. It's easy to say, well, a nuclear war would result in 4.5 mega deaths, and buildings would be destroyed, and there would be radiation everywhere, and all that kind of stuff. But to say, like, here's what it would look like in the end, it's something I think that people can point to.
Yeah, I imagine it's particularly evocative in America. I mean, so Europe is so relatively small and densely populated, but just knowing so much about American culture, I've certainly seen plenty of images of like the Dust Bowl or the Great Plains. I imagine it's not hard to picture like an entire continent being returned to that, where you have areas where it kind of already looks like that. Whereas in Europe, you find it hard to imagine what like Britain or France would look like after a nuclear war.
You're like, oh, just a bunch of green hills? Okay.
We just don't have those desolate, unoccupied places because we're so densely populated and built up, or it's just. So I'm recording this in the middle of a storm in Ireland, and it's just rained so much that everything is so green that you can't really imagine anything else.
Yeah, one of Schell's big thing is that he says, nuclear war is dangerous. It's a problem if it happens. It's world-ending. It's extinction level event. Yeah. And his whole way of trying to help people think about it is the government and the military and people who are in charge of this will have every incentive to stop it. They will put diplomatic approaches to stop it. They will have all these command and control systems to prevent accidents and things like that. But his worry is that even if there's a 1% chance that it will happen, it's a 1% chance that leads to 100% extinction.
Yep.
So that has to always be your calculation of how you think about this. It could go wrong, and if it does, it's over. So then it becomes, well, what is gift? We have to weigh that with the benefits that you get from it. And no, that's
for deterrence theorists, it's like so
they hate that.
when people say, "Oh, the threat to use nuclear weapons is not believable," especially when you have mutual vulnerability and the other side will retaliate. The idea of like, well, okay, maybe it's not rational for me to use weapons, and maybe the other side knows I probably won't use nuclear weapons. But if there's that 1% possibility, or even that there'd be an accidental use and all of a sudden we're in a nuclear war, that very small chance of enormous absolute cost is enough to make deterrence work.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you think this is mutual suicide, and it is not credible to threaten mutual suicide because you both just end up dead and no one gets anything, if there is a chance, however minuscule, that would happen, that is enough to keep the system functioning, especially if you have, so Thomas Schelling wrote about the idea of the threat that leaves something to chance. So this idea of you might have this irrational aspect that comes in, this so like an accident.
Mm-hmm.
So the way JFK was so worried in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that not that either side would deliberately attack each other, but that because you have aircraft flying so close to each other and ships in such close proximity, there might be an accident and a sudden unintentional escalation. So that, again, that threat that leaves something to chance of everything spiraling out of control is enough to keep deterrence working.
Right.
So I think it's interesting idea that anti-nuclear campaigners and deterrence theorists both kind of gravitate on this idea of the tiny chance and absolute costs, but you can frame it either way as being a reason to get rid of all nuclear weapons or a reason why nuclear weapons actually do work as a deterrent.
Well, it's interesting if you want to nitpick either of those metaphors, because you did mention, like, whoa, yeah, can insects actually survive with radiation, and cockroaches, and also the idea of humans disappeared, would cockroaches or rats or things like that survive? That's a really interesting question, because according to at least Schell, his approach is there are no more birds because of they're pretty susceptible to radiation, so insects no longer can. That was the thing that would hold them in check. So it's this idea of there are certain keystone species in an environment. You take some of those away, other populations will expand. If you don't have things hunting, if you don't have foxes, then you have a lot of squirrels, and if there's too many squirrels, they eat all the vegetation.
I remember a video that went viral, I think, on Twitter it might have been 6 months ago. I think it was about Yellowstone National Park, and how a couple of years ago they reintroduced wolves. And when they did that, the wolves started taking care, managing the deer population, which meant that other populations were reduced, that kind of thing. And over the space of a couple of years, the whole ecosystem rebalanced to the way it should have been before the wolves were eliminated. And so some of the comments were like, oh my gosh, it shows that wolves are this keystone species and they're so important. And other people went, no, what this shows is humanity is terrible, and because we hunted all the wolves, all the rest of nature went out of balance. But it's interesting, there's definitely a couple of schemes in Britain where they're talking about reintroducing wolves or other types of species because humanity has hunted these to the point of extinction. It's typically meant, particularly species like deer, have overpopulated so much that they've now completely skewed the ecosystem in one way. I suppose it's this idea of a complex, and this is again relevant to nuclear theorists, but this idea of complexity and interactive complexity of a system with so many moving parts that you can't really predict how they all function together. And if you take one thing away, the whole system can collapse. So much
like threads being pulled out of a sweater, right? Threads.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like
so in nuclear strategy, this is the fear, and this is people like Scott Sagan have written. So they say like deterrence might work most of the time, but that 1% chance is enough because accidents do happen, and at some point something will go wrong, and you can't guarantee that you won't get this series of chain reactions through this interactive complexity that we're going to end up with this catastrophic war that, even if it's inverted commas limited, can threaten so many different species on Earth, and that small possibility is enough to campaign against nuclear weapons.
Right, and that small possibility that basically leads to a bunch of small insects being the only thing that's left is, I think, a very powerful metaphor, and it's one that sticks in there pretty much. Well, the only thing that will survive are insects and cockroaches and things like that. And even if there are elements to say, well, they won't be an amazing number of, they won't thrive, but I think Schell at least says they'll be selectively destroyed. There'll be some that will be left, and every other thing will die off. So that'll be, at least for a while, what the world will look like. It's a very powerful picture because it is hard for people to grasp human extinction on its one end, especially when you have all these movies like 2012, right? Is that the movie 2012 or other world-ending events You can picture like something like that happening, but you can't picture really what would the world look like 100 years after that.
Yeah, I think the BBC also, it might have been the BBC, once did like a very short documentary series on, I think it was called something like What Comes After or After Us or something. And it was done as that thing of, they pick cities around the world and they show if humanity, like the leftovers, just disappeared tomorrow, not a catastrophe, we all just vanished, what would the world look like 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, and then like thousands of years? And it was absolutely fascinating.
I love that. I don't know if it's the same one, but there's a US series that I remember seeing. I loved that.
That might have been it. It might be talking about the same thing that I've probably seen on the BBC or something. But yeah, it's because it is hard to wrap your head around that, and it's even hard to wrap your head around those kind of timescales. So I remember reading about one of the things that happens, like all these people have dogs are so popular all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
There are dogs everywhere. But if all humans disappeared, apparently very quickly all the small species of dogs would disappear because dogs would basically have to go back to being feral.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be the large dogs would basically outcompete the small dogs. So goodbye Chihuahuas, and everyone who has like, Alsatians or whatever, they would thrive. There's this weird thing of like humanity interfering with evolution. And if we all just vanished in a blink, it's interesting how some of these shows or writings in this case make you think about humanity's role and how all the rest of nature has been molded around us, but what would happen if through human action we skewed it one way or another?
That series is fascinating too, because there's pieces of it that are about what would happen if there were no humans to keep a nuclear power plant running, and what would happen in terms of meltdowns and radioactivity, and how would that affect things. And one of my favorite television shows is a comedy show called Last Man on Earth. Yep. And Last Man on Earth, Will Forte, he liked that series that we're talking about so much. He said, this is a really good idea for a television show, because what if the only person to survive was like a schlump kind of person? And then, of course, spoiler alert, for later seasons of that show, a lot of those different points, like what would a nuclear power plant look like with no humans running it, which causes them to have to leave the United States because of all the nuclear power plants exploding and causing radioactivity and everything. Those plot points get introduced into the show. So I really am waiting for a good chance to do an episode, or maybe a mini nuke episode on that. So now that I know that you watch that show,
well, also much less seriously, there's a show on the CW called The 100, which is, so it's a proper guilty pleasure in the sense of it's incredibly silly. It's like a very much standard like CW show, and it's meant for 16 to 20 is probably the key demographic or something. But it is set in a world after a catastrophic nuclear war, but everyone who was in space, set in the future, and a couple of nations had space stations, and all those space stations combined, and so humanity has survived in one way, but and eventually they come back to Earth. And but one of the legacies is there were all these nuclear power plants that somehow survived this great war, and then they start going right into meltdown, and it's completely silly, and it's a properly turn off your brain, but it's also a real guilty pleasure.
All right, well, let's do an episode of the future where we combine Last Man on Earth and 100 and talk about that. All right, so let's move on to the next topic I have here, which is the premise of nuclear testing in Alamogordo causing radioactive ants in the desert. Is the plot of them. But let's do a real quick discussion about nuclear testing in New Mexico, just to provide a little extra level of context here. Nuclear testing, 1945, Trinity test, first place where a nuclear bomb was detonated or a nuclear device was detonated. And then 70 years since then, you can still actually get radioactivity signals popping up at that particular site. It's said to be about 10 times higher than the normal background radiation, but it's still relatively low. If you go there for an hour or so, which is open twice a year to go and visit, once in April and once in October, and I'm going to try to go to the site in October of next year. That's my goal. I went to the Nevada test site this year in 2018, so I'm going to try to go to the New Mexico site in 2019. But if you go there for about an hour, it's about half of the total radiation exposure you would get on an average day just from natural sources, medical sources around the world. So it's there, but it's not as bad as it possibly could be. But it's always fascinating to see, as through this testing program, what role radiation has had in popular culture. So a great article that I recommend people reading from 2012 by David Ropick in Scientific America called The Rise of Nuclear Fear, where I think he was reviewing a book, which I'll quote at the very end of this, which was how the United States, or how we learned to fear radiation. He cites a number of different movies, 1936, something called The Invisible Ray, where Boris Karloff, who's known to be, I think he was Boris Karloff the mummy in a lot of the old
sounds familiar.
Universal films. He used a radium ray to cure disease, but then it caused him to glow in the dark and he could kill anyone he touched. There were a bunch of Flash Gordon movies about radiation, atomic furnaces powering giant ships. There was a movie in 1940 called Murder in the Air, which is about a U.S. agent guarding the secret of an atomic ray cannon that could shoot enemy planes out of the sky. Fun reference here is that Ronald Reagan played the FBI or U.S. agent, and maybe that inspired...
Very Star Wars as well.
Yeah, it inspired him for that. But his whole point was that, quote, despite these science fiction fears, the public's attitude towards radiation remained decidedly positive. The news media carried regular reports of radiation benefits. 3/4 of the headlines on articles about radiation in American magazines were either neutral or equally divided between positive. Then the bombs went off, and a terrible flash in our relationship of nuclear radiation exploded into the profound angst that has shaped so many aspects of world history and modern culture. And there are certain touch points that I see here from there. So like in the 50s, this is kind of bleed a little bit into what you're going to talk about. So I won't go into too much detail. But one of the identifying points are nuclear testing, in particular, the Castle Bravo tests, which was a big atmospheric test out in the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, causing radiation damage on a fishing trawler. The Lucky Dragon 5 was a huge media attention of some of the dangers of nuclear war and nuclear radiation, but also a best-selling book by David Bradley in 1948 called No Place to Hide. And this discussed radiation dangers in great detail. Have you read this book before? I've only just seen references to it.
I've read about it.
Yeah, that's what I keep seeing. I should actually read the book at some point.
Yeah. And also I think one of the, so there are 23 people on it was a tuna fishing boat. So they were all quite heavily irradiated, and it was so tragic. The boat limps back to port. All the crew members were treated, and apparently they were all given blood transfusions, but the blood they were given was already infected with hepatitis C, so they all caught that. God. And apparently, only one person died as a result, because it turns out he had another underlying health condition that was aggravated by the hepatitis C and the acute radiation syndrome. But I think one of the people who survived, and many of them survived into properly into the 80s and 90s. One of the crew members did write a book. I think it was called something like The Lucky Dragon and I, which I came across. So I don't know if that's available or in translation or anything, but definitely been a couple of books written about it. Well, I've never read anything directly, but it's one of those. If you read a small amount about nuclear weapons,
it gets referenced.
You will come across the phrase "lucky dragon" pretty quickly. It was a very important cultural moment, definitely.
So this book here, No Place to Hide, it was written by a doctor. It's kind of like a semi-autobiographical story of his work as a radiological safety section officer, and it was about Operation Crossroads series of nuclear tests. So after the atomic bombings on Japan, the U.S. public was curious, I think is the right word for it, about what nuclear radiation could do, what the bomb was to do, because obviously the war that was ongoing was ended from their perspective because of atomic bombings. So then they're like, we need to know more information. We're curious what this means. So Crossroads was not just a scientific endeavor to figure out, new things about what the bomb could do, but also was a bit of propaganda, a lot of propaganda to show people, we got this. Here's all the amazing things that the bomb can do, but it's safe if you control everything just the right way. The public was invited to see the test through newsreels. A lot of celebrities showed up to try to show everything's perfectly fine. And this really tried to humanize the bomb. And after the tests took place and there was all this video footage, public interest in bomb testing dropped because they figured, it's like no longer interesting anymore. This amazing scientific achievement, world-altering event. Future tests were done in secret without observers for many, many years. And really, it took Bradley's book, which was a bestseller, to show the behind the scenes. It provided data on radiation illnesses, on plant life, on humans, pollution that would cause by atomic tests. And it offered a counter argument to a official government reports. And then you introduce, movies and film into this. You can really see how the movie Them has a fascinating, unique place in history. It's not just the historical piece that, facts and government reports and in real life events, but film and pop culture really shapes how people understand these things for either positive or negative ways.
One reason films like this are interesting is they provide a really interesting snapshot as to what society was worried about at the time. All science fiction and horror, in a way, it should be about something else. So whatever the premise is, always exploring another topic through this ridiculous premise. Normally, like if Star Trek's often a morality play or that kind of thing. If you ever watch the classic Twilight Zone, they often have like a twist, and you find out at the end what it's really about. And, it leaves you thinking. And then Rod Sterling comes on and does his final thing to really put a bow on it. So on one hand, these kind of B movies, they reflect what society is worried about at the time, but they're also a very popular medium, very visual, reaches a lot of people, and they're also an active way of disseminating a message, or in this case, perhaps fear and anxiety. So they're both reflection and also an active agent in like social trends. So I find this period between the 40s and the 50s an absolutely fascinating time in nuclear weapons and nuclear history, because I think as a modern audiences or just modern sensibilities, when we approach nuclear weapons, you can't help but do it with certain cultural baggage and programming already built in. So you think of nuclear weapons, you think of a mutual nuclear war, you think of escalation, you think of phrases like nuclear winter, the end of all life on Earth. Nuclear weapons are bad things and will lead to extinction. Those are valid concerns, but they are concerns that have grown up and been developed across a number of generations, different events. We have been programmed to think in a certain way, if you like, by society adapting to the bomb over all these years. Immediately after the first use of nuclear weapons, however, in 1945, none of that programming existed. So there's an absolutely fascinating period so you touched upon the prehistory, kind of before 1945, before anyone had heard of an atomic bomb. We knew about radioactivity, but radiation was seen as almost like a positive thing. So there's this weird history in like the 30s of people deliberately dosing themselves with radiation because they thought it was healthy. All these radium-related products, people kind of thinking it was good for you, take your daily dose of radiation and like Vita rays, you'll be stronger the next day.
Yeah, we went into that in our Fallout video game episode, but also the episode we did on atomic alcohol, because we were drinking things that were atomic themed, trying to get into that particular piece. So I enjoyed that aspect.
You do look back on it now and you think, oh my God, you idiots, how did you not know? But it would be like if you found out that eating 5 portions of fruit and veg a day actually was toxic. Yeah. That's something we're all told now is good for you. And, imagine one day in the future, like, oh my God, they were eating fruits and vegetables, the idiots. But obviously, in 1945, you have the public learn about nuclear weapons through these 2 awful attacks. But there's this fascinating moment, especially at least for the victorious Western powers, and particularly America, where nuclear weapons were, despite having seen their destructive power, were seen as positive. Because as you touched on, they ended the war as far as the public were concerned. And the US was victorious.
And the US was also the only one to have them.
Absolutely. And so they were almost, in a sense, the instrument of victory. And so there's kind of weird rush to be associated with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons and nuclear science was the literal figurative cutting edge of human progress and achievement. And you get all these businesses trying to jump on the nuclear bandwagon. I think it's like if you go through like the Nevada phone book at the time, you see all these businesses suddenly start adding like atomic into their titles. And it's quite a famous picture. I think it's like, was it Miss Nevada competition for like 1946? And the winners there wearing a dress that looks like a mushroom cloud. And you look back on that now and you cringe at how tone deaf it is. This is a weapon of mass destruction. But the point is, society viewed this innocently and naively, but also positively. So you have this initial period of enthusiasm and naivety, and definitely an element of triumphalism. I mean, obviously Japan's having a completely different reaction to atomic weapons at the time, so we shouldn't forget to think about how the rest of the world saw this. But I find the early 50s be fascinating because it's when that period of naivety and even positivity starts to change. And I think there's a couple of different drivers of that. One of the biggest is the atmospheric nuclear testing that starts to take place that we've referred to here, and also coupled with the development of the hydrogen bomb. Almost as important as the development of atomic weapons themselves, because this weapon that you thought was already the most destructive thing that could possibly exist is suddenly exceeded by a weapon of orders of magnitude greater.
Mm-hmm.
So often, I mean, even the scientists making hydrogen weapons didn't necessarily know what was going to happen until they detonated this. I think so. One of the more interesting ones is the Castle Bravo shot. So this on the 1st of March, 1954. So around about the time them's already been made and might have already come out. I don't know when in 1954 it was released. So this was preceded in 1952 by the first hydrogen bomb test, the Ivy Mike shot, but that wasn't a bomb. I can imagine something dropped by a plane. That was something that was like the size of a building to prove the science. Castle Bravo, though, in 54 was a deliverable weapon. It turned out to be 15 megatons, which was the largest ever US nuclear test. But before they detonated it, the scientists didn't know how big it was going to be. And how they discovered this was actually by blowing it up. And there's an interesting parallel to that test also is the first scene of the most recent Godzilla remake.
Mm-hmm.
That film gets it wrong because it implies that modern weapons are actually bigger than that, whereas actually that was the largest ever US. But I know you've done that in the previous episode. Continued nuclear testing. These are happening not below ground, but in the atmosphere or by blowing up chains of islands. The weapons themselves are getting orders of magnitude bigger, and eventually this starts to filter through into the public consciousness. So despite the US government's attempt to actively tell people don't be afraid of radioactivity, as you said, like, oh, we got this, don't worry, it can't harm you, or even if it is harmful, there are steps you can take to protect yourself, and US civil defense films continue to push this idea quite strongly through atmospheric testing, through incidents such as the Lucky Dragon irradiation, through journalism and books being published. Gradually, society becomes much more anxious about the idea of nuclear weapons in general, but particularly focuses in on this idea of radioactivity, of this great but unknown force. I think about how mysterious this would be if you genuinely didn't know what radioactivity was. Nobody knew what it really did to the human body, to nature.
And the fact that it's invisible, I think people are pretty always concerned about. Pollution you can see. You can see acid rain. You can see sludge in your rivers. But radiation is invisible and you don't know what's happening. That's always been
it lingers after the explosion. I mean, one of the most saddest aspects of nuclear weapons, if you like, it's not just that it's something that so many pieces of nuclear culture have done. The idea of, after the war is finished, the horror continues because it gets blown around or the area is irradiated. This is the first weapon humanity has that continues to kill after the war has already been over, even if the war only lasted 15 minutes. So I find this period in the early 50s, particularly around about 53, 54, when all these B movies start to come out, it's this moment of change in society's the attention being paid in particular to nuclear weapons, a specific anxiety about radioactivity, an ignorance about its effects, but also a curiosity, as you mentioned. This is finding expression through all of these B movies, these silly monster movies. But it's also, I think these films are quite active in pushing this idea of, actually, this might be something you should be afraid of. Whether or not it causes giant ants, whatever, but definitely this is some force we don't understand. And I think it's an interesting theme in all of these films. Not only do they use radioactivity as a means of, the MacGuffin to make these things mutate, but in all of these films there's a common theme of mankind is acting at the edge of its own genius and wisdom. I think there's a good reason to watch some of these films, even though they vary wildly in quality, because they provide a very important window into that particular transition into a much more contemporary mindset, where we automatically think of nuclear weapons as bad, dangerous, and we specifically tie into ideas of radioactivity and danger not only to the people hit by the bomb, but the entire ecosystem, even the whole planet. I think that is where this narrative emerges from, if you like.
Yeah.
And in some extent, it is a specific reaction against the development of the hydrogen bomb and particular atmospheric testing. And just for the for the sake of completeness, if you like, lots of the anti-nuclear movements that we know today often grew out of this specific period, and often in opposition to nuclear testing. So in Britain, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, nuclear weapons were not that controversial in Britain in the 40s and the 50s, even despite some of these incidents being wildly reported and that kind of thing. It was only when fears about radioactivity and atmospheric testing started to become really mainstream that you got a public opposition that started to organize itself against the idea that perhaps nuclear weapons aren't that great and definitely should Britain or other countries have them. And eventually that coalesces and becomes organized in formal institutions like CND. I think it's when nuclear anxieties become mainstream and become organized.
Not every nuclear weapon movie has to be showing a mushroom cloud or be literally about the people who survive an attack. Like, there can be other ways to tell this story and to tell these concerns without having that explicit imagery. There's a place for The Day After and Threads, and there's a place for those to exist. There's a place for Dr. Strangelove to exist, and there's a place for these kind of B-movie films that express a moment in time, an anxiety, and tell this story a little bit differently. Which are exactly the kind of things that if you and I were to be in 1954, maybe we're in a group of people at a drive-in theater, because I think those used to exist still in 1950s, and we're literally in a parking lot, and we roll our windows down, and we start to talk about this film. I think this would be a good point to get into what we'd be talking about. But I guess kind of my first question here is, does this movie hold up today? Like, do you think that this film would be something you could recommend to people that weren't interested in the nuclear side? Like, I was really struggling with that, because at the beginning of the movie it was good. The middle definitely dragged, and by the end I didn't love it, but I could recognize how important it must have been back then.
I think the pacing is definitely uneven. It's more uneven than I remembered. So I hadn't revisited this film probably about 8 to 10 years, and it's probably about the third time I've seen it.
Okay.
So I did enjoy it. I was entertained by it. I think it's helped by things like the having watched a couple of these films as well in a quite short succession. It's helped by the scale of the production, the fact that it's not been shot in miniature with stop motion. There is something quite fun about watching these giant ants getting flamethrowered in the face.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. Something's on fire, something burned.
It is definitely unevenly paced. I think it's helped by the fact that it's also in black and white, and it can hide. I think it's called hiding the crimes in the trailer. It's you can't see the seams as much because it's black and white. Maybe if it was in color, it would look a bit more ropey.
So supposedly it was supposed to be originally in color. It was going to be one of the first Warner Brother movies that was going to get the color treatment, and also it was supposed to be in 3D, because now that 3D is so popular here in the States. Yeah. But it's coming back because it's more of like a retro thing. There were a lot of these 3D movies with 3D glasses. This movie was supposed to be shot, and was originally shot partially in 3D. You can actually still see some of the cameras, the 3D cameras. They just left them in as props for the film itself. But they ran out of budget, or they cut the budget at the last minute, so they ended up being in black and white, except for the opening title of the movie is in color. And then beyond that, everything is in black and white. But this movie works better. If it was not in black and white, I don't think it would work as well.
No. And I think when you compare it to the other films of the genre and of the time, I think it's second best behind only Godzilla. So I had not watched the original Godzilla properly. I'd probably seen most of it through clips, but as part of preparation for this and as comparison, I did sit down and watch it a couple of days ago, and it's genuinely excellent. I mean,
it's really good.
It does suffer from the thing of like, it's all done in miniature, and a tiny helicopter looks like a tiny helicopter no matter how far you stretch your brain. But that is a much more, technically better shot, but also just contemplative, methodical. It knows what it's going to do. It deals with larger themes and issues in a much more nuanced way than them does. But having said that, Godzilla is obviously one of the most famous films of all time, so it's not the worst thing to say them is not as good as that. But I definitely say of the genre, it probably comes in about second. I think you can watch it even if you're not interested in the nuclear stuff, but you're definitely going to get most out of it if you have some kind of interest in nuclear weapons or the culture of the 50s and where that anxiety came from. The one area, though, that I know we both found very problematic and difficult to watch, and the film does not age well, is just in the issue of representation.
Mm-hmm.
So we touched upon this a few bits in the discussion, but the sexism pervading this film, it's not only bad, I think it's bad for the standards of the time. There are only about 3 female characters in the film, so they're portrayed. So one of them is a scientist. So you'd say, oh, that's positive. A woman is being portrayed in the 50s as a scientist, as a person who's knowledgeable. But the film kind of looks for every opportunity to like make fun of her or to put her on the other side of the other characters, which is just grating and just seems really anachronistic.
Mm-hmm.
And other than that, women are either depicted as victims, and then the other woman in a speaking role in this film is this really weird scene where the police are looking for. They're investigating where might these ants be. Are there any strange reports? And they pull in a couple of people who have been arrested for public intoxication and one woman who was speeding. And so they go to this woman and say, "Oh, what, you were arrested going 60 miles an hour? Why were you in such a hurry? Were you escaping from something?" and the woman goes, "No, I was visiting a sick friend. Well, I won't tell you his name because he's married." And then she's in a room with 6 guys who look at each other, all exchange a look and go, "Oh, okay, you can leave." And it's this really weird, I think it's meant to be comedic, but it comes across purely as slut shaming. And it is so weird that the film, it comes out of nowhere. It doesn't need to be there. The film goes out of its way to do this. And it just, watching it, it's just, the film kept coming back to these moments. It was funny, I was watching Godzilla, 11 minutes into Godzilla. There's a really weirdly sexist bit in that as well. But that was only like one moment in the whole film. Which you can kind of think, oh, well, it was the 50s and it's another culture that I don't know the sensitivities to. Maybe I can't judge as much. This film, however, it was just absolutely clanging. So it's the one bit I was like, okay, maybe recommend them to people, but with a massive asterisk and saying, it's a film from the 50s. I think you can see one person of color in the whole film in a montage.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, well, that's probably not surprising given Hollywood in the 50s. But even by the standards of the time, I think this film is pretty damn sexist.
Yeah,
women stuck in my craw a bit.
Women are either inconsolable, criminal, or incompetent is kind of how it's described. Beyond that, which is very unfortunate in terms of wanting to just be able to introduce people to the film. I think you could still do it. You just have to tell people to caveat it when they're coming into it. But what else do you think this movie? We talked about all the different genres of atomic film from that time period. Some were using radiation as a MacGuffin. Other ones were trying to tell a contemplative story. Because a lot of them, you see, there are fear of nuclear attack and fear of radiation. Has the Cold War gotten hot? Was one of the reporters asked. Or there's also a sense of guilt and comeuppance that sometimes filmmakers want to introduce as a story. Godzilla is here to destroy us because of what we've done with radiation, and we should feel guilty about that particular side of it. Fortunately, he's still attacking Japan, which sucks. Until the later films when he goes around the world. But then also super interesting how Godzilla becomes also a hero.
Well, even in Godzilla, humanity. I find, so obviously we're not meant to be on Godzilla's side because he is destroying cities and we see characters that we're meant to care about living in fear and that kind of thing. But at the same time, there's a scientist in Godzilla who, again, he's a zoologist and he has a daughter in the film, and a weird parallel to them. They're going around researching Godzilla. And this scientist wants to save Godzilla because he sees it as, it's just a creature. And he's also learned how to live with radioactivity. And we should learn from that rather than killing it. And even when Godzilla, spoiler, dies in the film, or seems to die, it's presented in a really sad, somber moment. And you kind of feel for the monster in the film. And it is presented in a sense of Godzilla has been, in this case, released. He's not caused by radiation, but he's released by atomic testing, has opened his cave kind of thing. Mm-hmm. He's been released because of mankind's folly, specifically in developing weapons of mass destruction. So, on some extent, this is on us and this is our punishment. But at the same time, it's kind of presented as it's just an animal. It's just doing what animals do. Mm-hmm. And does it necessarily deserve to die? So it's funny how later films Godzilla becomes the hero and he's here to save us from the other monsters. And
that's exactly the thing that I liked about certain Godzilla stories or stories about giant monsters in general is, and I think this is sometimes deployed as a tool for nuclear discussion, is indifference. The bomb is indifferent to people. The bomb is a creation, but like radioactive science and the science of fission and fusion and all of that, it's indifferent to people. It doesn't matter. It's going to happen, and it doesn't pick sides. It doesn't care if you are a person or if you're a plant life or anything. And Godzilla's just general indifference in something that we can't fully understand, fully control, is a similar way that people think about the bomb. The bomb is something that takes on a life of its own, often because we as people put it onto it, and it becomes an indifferent tool that can uniquely indiscriminately destroy humanity, people, buildings, innocents, people who are targets of attack, all of those things. And the monsters in them, the monsters, quote unquote, the ants, are largely just acting like ants. They're just being ants, but they're given better tools. They're larger. They're doing all the things that they would do if they were just larger. You know, if your cat became a 10-foot large cat, it would kill you and eat you. Like my cat is sitting sleepily right next to me, but if she was my size, she would just eat me. She wouldn't care. She'd be like, "You don't give me enough wet food. You're wet food now." And I always think that's a fascinating take on this, because some of the best horror films and best science fiction thriller movies are that which seems at one point we can understand and have some sense of control over it, but then you strip that away and you don't have that ability to affect your environment and your own story. You're no longer in control of your own story, is a frightening thing for me. And I know that's kind of one of the things that affects a lot of other people, is no longer being in control. And I think the bomb, the thing that concerns a lot of people is you don't know how do you deal with something like that as an individual? How do you have agency? And I think Them does a really good job of that.
Yeah, I think that's what lots of these films are tying into, is a sense of mankind acting at the very limits of its ability to control the consequences of its action, and also to act with wisdom. And there's a sense in all of these films of this could go either way. So these films are often explicitly at the very last line of this film is this. Yeah. There's the scientist saying, you know, if we don't act a bit more with a bit more wisdom, who knows what's going to happen in the future. It's quite explicitly saying we need to be more thoughtful about this. So I think you can definitely see some of these films as advocacy. I think Them is on the more well done end of the spectrum of this. Some of these B films are much more clumsy and not looking to be as philosophical. They are just using radiation as the MacGuffin to get to the giant thing, so we can just have a horror film.
So let's talk about Them. Let's rate it, because we always like to rate our movies on a consistent scale of 1 to 5, 1 being pretty bad and 5 being great. But because we get super critical about the plot, let's get super critical in our rating system. I ran the numbers here, and let's do 1 out of 5 sacks of sugar. 1 sack is barely enough to feed a growing ant, but 5 sacks of sugar can supply an entire colony. How many sacks of sugar would you give the movie Them?
Can we do halves?
Sure. You can cut open you can pour out a little bit of the sugar.
This has some sugar packets. In which case, I think I'll go for 3.5.
Oh, okay.
For me, it's so some of the production behind the film, the sound design is particularly excellent. I think if I hadn't watched this film like 10 years, as soon as I heard the ants cry, it was immediately familiar, and it's actually quite creepy.
It is.
And I think the scale of the ants and the way it's presented and some of the action sequences are very good. As a film, though, it does also drag, and I can't really forgive it the sexism even for the standards of the time. But I also I think I recognize that it's a very influential film, I think, in the genre, and I kind of bump it up a bit for that. But you know, it wouldn't be the first one I reach to, maybe, if I want to watch a film from the period.
Yeah, so you're good for your decade of watching.
Yeah.
Let's talk in 2028 and let's watch it again. I would give it a 3. Kind of very similar. I think the last third of the movie just drags so much that you watch the first 2/3 of it, you got it, and then you can kind of watch just the last 5 minutes of it. But that's not too bad. I mean, it's about average for a film. It's particularly when you start to place in all the extra pieces of the culture and the context of it. And the special effects are fascinating too. Director Gordon Douglas recalled during editing, he asked the editor, "So how does it look?" And the editor responded, "Fine." And then the director said, does it look honest? Does it look like a real giant ant? And the editor says, as honest as a 12-foot ant can look. So that's not too bad. I mean, it is fun to watch, and because of all if you watch it and also then listen to the podcast and have that piece of how it fits into nuclear history, I would certainly recommend that people do it.
And also, if you're a fan of Marvel's Ant-Man, there's a scene in them where the scientist is explaining different types of ants and their functions. That is exactly the scene. I think unintentionally, Michael Douglas explaining what the different ants are and how they're going to be used by Ant-Man. You can't help but watch it in this post-Marvel age in which we exist and go, yeah, I can see that. That's very familiar, definitely.
Yep, and I like the Ant-Man series quite a lot. I haven't realized that is totally true. Those scenes are nearly identical. Go watch Ant-Man, and if you have other things to recommend, this is normally the part of the podcast where we do that. So I've got 4 quick things, and maybe you have some too that aren't Marvel related. But first, pick up a copy of The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell. To one of the books I mentioned earlier. You can get some of the articles online if you have a New Yorker subscription. I do not. So that book is out there, and it's really there are definitely other things he's written that are online that you don't have to pay for. So I would check out some of his writing on nuclear history. I would also recommend another book called Atomic Age Cinema: The Offbeat, the Classics, and the Obscure, from 2018 as a recent print from Barry Atkinson. It's written from a fan of Atomic Age Cinema, and it's mostly just goes through and the history, and it's not really a lot about atomic things, but it is fun for people who like this genre. Have you heard of this book before?
No, I don't think I have.
I'm gonna mail it to you.
Oh, amazing.
I've read it. I got everything it needs out of it, but as a fan of the genre, I would love it if I'll send that to you after the podcast. The next thing is a book that I mentioned earlier by Spencer Weart, Wehrt. I don't think that's how you pronounce his last name, but he wrote a book called The Rise of Nuclear Fear from 2012. It is a book I should have mentioned on the podcast before because I've read it a couple times, and it's really terrific for tracing nuclear history from the dawn of the atomic age through Fukushima, and a big piece of it is about the development of pop culture. And it's one that I've certainly have thought about a lot when I do podcasts like this. So I'll formally introduce it here as something people should be reading. Finally, I'll link to the article I mentioned earlier about the colony of doomed ants in Poland.
That's going to keep me up at night, that one.
It's pretty crazy. The article is from 2016. It's called Ants Trapped in Nuclear Bunker Are Developing Their Own Society. So check that out. Tim, what do you got for us?
Okay, well, for me, just a couple of small things. So one is a book. I can't remember if I recommended this before. I've definitely mentioned it before. I swear, so I'm a graduate student. I swear I have read other books, but I just keep the fact I keep returning to this one is just because I think it's so well written. So it's by a historian called Gerard de Groot, and it's called, depending on if you're in Britain and the US, it's either called The Bomb, A Life, or The Bomb, A History of Hell on Earth. I think it's marketed differently in different markets. It's quite short, but it's basically like a skip through the whole history of the development of nuclear weapons. But the writer has a particular interest in not just the big history and the big figures, but also society and culture. And it's also just one of the best written, like narratively most satisfying books. So I think I would strongly recommend. It's always find a place on my shelf.
You studied with this person, right?
Yeah, I did. So, but a long time ago, and I promise I'm not getting a cut of any like increased modest sales or whatever. But again, there's one of the certain classes you take when you're an undergrad have a really big influence on you.
Yep.
And I think any class on nuclear weapons should include looking at society and culture, not just strategy and science, because these are living relevant issues, but also they change significantly from generation to generation. So I think that's why one of the reasons them is so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of the academic spectrum, because so much of the background to these films is thermonuclear weapons. I think just Richard Rhodes' book Dark Sun on the making of the hydrogen bomb.
Terrific.
It's intimidating by just the size of it. It is a massive piece of scholarship. As an academic, I think the development of hydrogen bombs are as important as the development of atomic bombs. But Richard Rhodes' book on just how that innovation came about, I think, is genuinely fascinating, even if it is a little bit drier. but it's worth. And final thing, just because I had never watched it in its entirety, but I think the original Godzilla film, so something you can actually just watch rather than read. I don't particularly want to compare the two because maybe it's not fair, but I think it is a better film than them. But as I still enjoy them, solid 3.5 film.
Not bad.
But I think if you want more philosophical treatment of nuclear weapons and monsters, it is worth seeking out Godzilla. I'm glad I did it and actually watched the real thing, and it also, I think, almost erased the memory of Matthew Broderick from my memory.
Have you seen any of the new ones? I guess maybe just the first one. The X one's coming out next year.
I quite enjoyed it. It was a little bit uneven, but I enjoyed it. It just starts with a clanging mistake where it says, we see the Castle Bravo shot, and I think they say later, like, oh no, but our weapons are bigger than that now. And like, no, they're not. That was the biggest weapon you ever had. That's the opposite of what you just said. And it's the first 5 minutes of the film. I'm like, oh, it better get better than this.
So we just did a podcast episode on asteroids versus nukes. Yep. And the very first scene, the first words said by, I think, Charleston Heston in Armageddon, when you see an image of the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, it's like it exploded with the force of 10,000 nuclear bombs. And you're like, no, it exploded with the force of like 2 billion nuclear bombs. It destroyed everything.
An order of magnitude. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah. Like, all right, very cool. Well, Tim, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast. I think I told people it was going to be a short episode. We've been recording for about 2.5 hours. I'll edit this down so that it's a little bit easier, because a 90-minute movie, people. We definitely went longer than the movie itself, but that's okay. This is what we do. We get super critical.
Ask a simple question, and you'll get a rambling answer.
Well, I always appreciate you coming on the show and to talk about this. We should do this more than just once a year. When new things come up, we'll talk about Battlestar Galactica at some point. We'll talk about Last Man on Earth. We'll talk about all these things over and over again.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, hey, you want to tell us what we got wrong, ant-wise or nuke-wise, a couple ways you can contact the show. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. We're also on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast, and email the old-fashioned way, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed the show, you can either go on iTunes or wherever you listen and give us a 5-star review, tell us what we should be covering. Or if you don't like to leave a public record for your strong interest in nuke pop culture, just tell a friend about the podcast. Tell them why you should listen and why it's this kind of crazy show where people talk for 3 hours about a movie from the 50s, about atomic ants. They might like it too. So until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And I'm Tim Collins.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.